Today we're going to break down Aroldis Chapman. How is he able to still throw 105 miles an hour at 36 years old? How has he been able to sustain this for this long while staying healthy? And how much longer could he continue to throw this hard? But before that, I'm Ben Brewster, co-founder of Tread Athletics. We train thousands of high school, college, and professional pitchers in a remote and in-house capacity. If you're interested in learning more about that, check it out in the description down below. Let's dive in. So we asked you guys what you wanted us to focus on in this video, and the overwhelming majority of you guys said, let's focus on how has he been able to stay healthy. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about how his pitching mechanics have adjusted a little bit over the past couple of years to be able to see a slight resurgence and uptick in his velocity. And we'll touch on his lifting routine as well. You guys said, screw it, we don't want to know about his arsenal and off speed, so we're not going to touch that. If you guys want a more in-depth breakdown on his mechanics and what he does so well to make him an outlier, we did a full deep dive video on that a couple of years ago. I'll link that as well. So Aroldis Chapman has been remarkably durable over the course of his career and a very productive reliever. A 7-time All-Star, he's 18th all-time in saves, and he has 8 of 10 of the hardest pitchers of all time. With a minimum of 500 innings pitched, he has the highest career Ks per 9 at 14.77. And if you look at his baseball savant numbers, it's just absolutely absurd. I mean, he's 95th to 99th percentile in just about everything outside of a couple command-based metrics. You look at his walk percentage this year, and he's first percentile. So it's basically that video game create a player type thing. If you could go in and you could just crank everything up to one side, that's basically Aroldis Chapman. But all things considered, he's been a very productive reliever for a long time, and we're going to get into exactly how he's been able to sustain that. So I have to touch on some of Aroldis Chapman's physical outlier qualities because, again, he is a physical specimen, and it's going to give some context to the rest of the video because he is an anomaly in certain aspects. One, he's got very long levers, so he's 6'4" with proportionally long arms and long legs. Here he is next to Aaron Judge, who's 6'7". Again, you can see he's got very long levers. The second is he's paired that with hypermobility or congenital laxity. So he's hypermobile. He has a ton of range of motion throughout his shoulder, throughout his hips, throughout his spine. And so this potentially allows him to apply force over a longer range of motion. And when paired with a very high level of strength, which we'll talk about, potentially allows for applying a large amount of force over a long range of motion. He's highly elastic. He's extremely fast twitch. If you were to study his muscle fibers, you would find a high proportion of fast twitch fibers similar to other power athletes, Olympic sprinters, and again, super athletic as well. So just how healthy has Aroldis Chapman been able to stay? When it comes to keeping his arm healthy, he's only had shoulder inflammation twice. He's had elbow inflammation once. So he's been able to largely avoid the injury bug when it comes to arm injury to this point in his career. Putting in perspective how impressive this is, all else equal, higher velocity we know does have a direct correlation to higher torques on the elbow and shoulder. We also know that more than 1/3 of active MLB pitchers have had Tommy John surgery. And so this is an extremely common injury, and he's managed to, as one of the hardest throwers of all time, if not the hardest thrower of all time, largely avoid that injury bug. While there is an association between higher velocity and higher injury risk and higher torques, there's also an association between higher velocity and higher performance. And this is just an inevitable piece of the game. All else equal, if you throw harder, you're going to be more effective. It also potentially, on average, leads to increased injury risk. And that's really the conflict that MLB and that baseball in general is working to try to figure out. To put this in perspective, if we look at what the likely torque Chapman is putting on his elbow is, our data team found that it's likely going to be somewhere between 113 and 143 Newton meters of torque. Now, there's no way to know for sure without putting him through a motion capture analysis, but this equates to somewhere between roughly a 63-pound to an 80-pound dumbbell hanging from his arm at peak layback. So there's an incredible amount of torque that he is putting on his arm. This still is a fairly large bandwidth where he might be towards the lower end of that range, he might be towards the higher end of that range. And I'm gonna make an argument for why I believe he's probably closer to the lower end of that range due to his mechanical efficiency and how efficiently he uses his entire body from the lower half through his torso, including his glove arm, to generate that velocity in a slightly more safe manner. There's also some evidence of an increased risk of injury for athletes that are hypermobile or do have congenital laxity. So again, it makes it even more impressive that he's been able to stay largely healthy throughout the course of his career, being as lax as he is. So I'm gonna touch on 4 factors I believe have contributed to his ability to stay healthy over the course of his career. First is his lifting routine and his body transformation. So he's completely revamped his entire body over the course of his career. The second is his mechanics, how efficiently he actually moves down the mound, how efficiently he uses his entire body, his entire kinetic chain to supply that velocity. Number 3 is workload, so how he's been able to keep that overall workload down over the course of his career to mitigate that injury risk. And number 4 would be genetic factors. Now, a quick disclaimer here, I'm no way making a prediction that he will or won't get hurt. If you watch this video 2, 3, 4 years down the line, and maybe he has gotten hurt, it doesn't invalidate anything in this video. Managed to stay very healthy for a very long period of time. At some point, he might break down. It's inevitable at a certain point, but it doesn't invalidate anything that I'm saying in this video, whether he does get Tommy John 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. But first, let's do a quick refresher on how exactly UCL tears happen, because that seems to be the main injury that people want to know about. How is he avoiding getting Tommy John surgery? So we're gonna have our skeleton friend help us out here. Now, the first point to note is that the UCL itself is not really equipped to handle the torques that hard-throwing pitchers are putting on their arm, not by themselves anyway. The failure rate for a UCL is somewhere around 35 Newton meters. Again, there are going to be genetic factors, pitcher to pitcher. So again, Chapman might have a much higher cross-sectional area, a much larger and thicker UCL. We don't know. The point being that torque that we're putting on our arm as we transition from layback from that external rotation position through acceleration into internal rotation, that UCL alone is not going to be enough to stabilize the elbow in that position. And so as we transition through layback, there's a medial gapping force that happens. And so that gapping force is essentially a force that's trying to push our arm in this direction. Now, our arm doesn't just snap after each throw, right? So what happens is the forearm muscles, what are called the flexor pronator muscles, are acting to actually stabilize the medial elbow. So actually to prevent that medial gapping force from bypassing and going into the UCL, the flexor pronator muscles are actually contracting, stabilizing that joint isometrically, and preventing that medial gapping from happening. So the forearm muscles are strong. If they're fresh, if they're not fatigued, they're able to prevent that gapping from happening and make sure that torque is not offloaded and bypassed to the UCL. This is also why regularly pitching through fatigue is such a high risk factor for injury, is because once those flexor muscles are no longer strong, they're no longer fresh, more of that torque is going to be bypassed to the UCL. And so we're able to keep the workloads down, we're able to not regularly throw through fatigue, and we're able to make sure that those forearm muscles are nice and strong. It can help to stabilize and offload torque from the UCL. It'd be impossible to look at Aroldis Chapman's physique when he came into the league at 185 pounds to now at 235 pounds and look at his forearms, which have almost doubled in size, and not conclude that his forearm muscles are stronger now than they were when he entered the league. So this has certainly played a protective role in keeping his elbow healthy. So we already alluded to it, but let's touch on that first factor that I think has helped him stay healthy, which is that lifting routine, which is that body revamp. Now, he has completely reinvented his body over the course of his career, starting off as that skinny 185-pound pitcher. And if you look at the timeline and the corresponding max velocities per year, you can see there's just been a steady increase in his body weight over the years, gaining almost 50 pounds of weight over this time. Again, majority of this appears to be quality lean mass. Now, this is really unheard of, very unusual that somebody's already going to be breaking into the big leagues, already throwing 102 plus miles an hour when they still have 50 pounds left to add to their frame. You almost never see that. So the fact that he was already able to do that already makes him somewhat of an outlier. He's already 235 pounds at this point. There's likely not much left he could do to fill out or add to his frame, but just looking at how strong he is, how big he is at this point, here he is bench pressing 315 pounds for multiple reps, which already puts him in those top percentiles for pitchers when it comes to upper body strength. We talked about how he's hypermobile, and so again, he's pairing this hypermobility, this incredible range of motion, with this top tier strength. So he's able to apply that high amount of force through a large range of motion, which is again similar to somebody like a Ben Joyce and becomes one of his superpowers and how he's able to throw so hard. What's interesting about his style of workouts, it seems to be, from the clips I could find, more so based around hypertrophy and strength type training. So he's doing higher rep type stuff, slower tempo type stuff, more bodybuilder oriented training, which isn't necessarily good or bad, but he's focusing more on the force side of the equation, less on the speed or the power side of the equation. Most players at some point are going to have to transition, and at some point in the offseason they transition to power type work, speed type work, which is going to be more based around performance and transferring everything to be more fast twitch on the mound. Aroldis Chapman is already so naturally fast twitch, he can prioritize most of his time just working on getting big, working on getting strong, whereas most players aren't going to be as successful if they just purely work on the hypertrophy side of the equation. The other interesting thing about the slower tempo type stuff is there's actually some evidence that eccentrics, slower tempo type training can actually be a positive when it comes to tendon health and injury resistance. And so the way Chapman's training, although it might not necessarily be as performance oriented, it works for him. It might actually be injury protective by doing this slower tempo bodybuilder type stuff. Another key point to make is that because he's so lax, he does not have to seem to prioritize mobility much in his training. When we train an athlete who we know has congenital laxity or hypermobility, again, mobility takes a backseat in their training. So he doesn't need to be focusing as much on the power, the speed side, or the mobility side, which isn't necessarily going to apply to a lot of pitchers watching this video. So the second factor in why I believe he's been able to stay largely healthy is his mechanics. Now, I've done a full deep dive in his mechanics, which again, you can see in another video. However, when it comes to his mechanics, he's highly efficient in terms of how he uses his entire body to produce that velocity. So all else equal, we know that increased velocity does equal increased torques. But again, there's going to be a lower end and a higher end of that range. So one simple analogy would be thinking about squatting, call it 400 pounds. There's no world in which squatting 400 pounds is super low stress or zero injury risk at all, but there's going to be a much higher injury risk version of squatting 400 pounds. So again, same thing when it comes to mechanics. If you can be in anatomical ranges, you can be efficient in terms of how you're sending that energy through your body and how that is being dissipated throughout the tendons, throughout the ligaments, and throughout the different joint segments, then you're going to be able to relatively mitigate some of that injury risk, even though the absolute injury risk is on average going to be higher. So one interesting note here is that because there's such a wide range with each velocity, it's actually theoretically possible that a 90-mile-an-hour pitcher with inefficient mechanics could be putting more torque on their arm than a 105-mile-per-hour pitch with efficient mechanics. And so again, we don't know, but it's likely that Chapman's torque values are actually a lot lower than you would expect for somebody throwing 100 plus miles an hour. So here are 4 things in his mechanics that have been shown to be inversely related with injury risk in the research. The first is going to be high torso and lead arm momentum. So essentially, how well does he utilize his trunk and glove arm to create that torso rotational velocity, right? We know with Chapman that he's able to delay his torso from opening very, very long into throw. He's able to stay very, very closed off and generate insane torso rotational velocities. He's also able to use that glove arm to really hold close and create an insane unload from the glove arm. So he's delaying that shoulder rotation, that torso rotation, as long as he possibly can, getting into some insane positions. The second is going to be proper timing of the torso and arm. So again, where is the torso at landing? Where is the arm at landing? Is that arm flipped up in position to actually accept layback as his torso begins to rotate? Is his arm down, late, out of plane? If you go up against a wall and you do a stretch with your arm down, you're going to feel that stress go to the front of your shoulder. His arm is absolutely on time, in plane, and flipped up at landing in these relatively safe ranges. The third is high alignment between the rotational planes of the torso and of the arm. So essentially, as he rotates his torso, does the arm find the same plane of rotation as his torso, or is his arm climbing up or dragging down? He's able to get that arm in plane with the torso to maximize the efficiency of his delivery. And the fourth and final thing would be more lead knee extension. So how well is he using that front leg to block and actually send the energy up the chain? And you can see as he plants, lands firmly on that front leg, that knee continues to extend. And so he's really using the lower half effectively to send that energy up the chain, taking some of that load off the elbow. So in summary, Chapman is probably producing much higher torques than the average player watching this video, but he's doing it about as safely as it could be done. But what about workload? This is the next factor that I want to explore. He's been able to keep his workload relatively low as a relief pitcher over the course of his career. Aroldis Chapman tends to throw an inning at a time with very few exceptions. So he's averaging around 1 inning per outing. If you look at instances in which he's thrown 2 innings in an outing, it's very, very rare. And so he hasn't been abused. Again, as a relief pitcher, he's also going to hold up theoretically better than a starting pitcher, just because the overall innings, overall workload over the course of the season is going to be lower than a starting pitcher. So you look at the velocity decline, you look at some of the injury problems with typical starting pitchers who also throw very, very hard. It's just a little bit more difficult to stay healthy when your workload is so much higher as a starting pitcher. To reiterate, this is super, super important because we know that fatigue is a big risk factor when it comes to injury risk. And so one study actually found a 36-fold, yes, 36-fold increase in injury risk of a major arm injury when regularly throwing through fatigue. Can't hammer home this point enough. Regularly pitching through fatigue is such a big risk factor that if you're able to manage the workloads, it can massively reduce the risk of injury over somebody who's maybe throwing 85, 90 miles an hour, but has bad mechanics and doesn't really keep track of the workload side of the equation, isn't strong, doesn't have efficient mechanics. So another piece of this is potentially more conservative off-season throwing. So his velocity has historically always been there in spring training. So he's not necessarily pushing it ultra aggressively throughout the off-season in his throwing program. Now, I heard from Hector Berrios, his off-season pitching coach, that he didn't get over 97 miles an hour leading up to the 2023 season. Now, he still was up to 104 miles an hour in the 2023 season. So that's the equivalent of somebody who throws 98 miles an hour, not throwing over 90 miles an hour an entire offseason. And so you can see he's probably throwing 75, 80, 85% effort throughout most of the offseason. He's relatively conservative. He's not airing it out. He's not being ultra aggressive because he knows the velocity has historically been there when spring training comes around. Worth noting, most pitchers are not Chapman. And so if you throw 92 miles an hour and you know you're not going to get drafted unless you throw mid-90s, you have to at some point put the pedal to the metal. You have to push intensity. You have to push speed and power output in your training. You can't just train ultra conservatively all the time and actually expect to work on performance. And so you likely don't fall in that same camp as Aroldis Chapman. And the fourth factor is obviously genetic factors, different variables that we haven't touched on that we can't know as far as what he's able to do to stay healthy. One possible explanation could be UCL, cross-sectional area, or the thickness of his UCL. We definitely know it's possible to have a thinner or smaller UCL. You can recall the situation with Brady Aiken, who was a top draft pick, and in that medical screen they found he had a really thin UCL and they reduced his signing bonus, and he did go on to tear his UCL in the coming years. So certainly possible Aroldis Chapman's UCL could be built different, and there might be other things going on that we just can't know at this point in time. So we've covered some ideas as to why he's been able to historically stay healthy for as long as he has, or at least contribute to his ability to stay healthy, but how has his velocity been able to hold up as well as it has? There's this seemingly built-in assumption a lot of people have, especially fans who aren't necessarily in the player development space, have, that increased age always means lower velocity. But this is not necessarily true on an individual and on a year-to-year basis. And it doesn't mean somebody's cheating just because they're 31, 32, 33 years old and they see a 1, 2, 3 mile an hour uptick the following year. That would imply that that player was completely maxed out at 23, 24, 25 years old and had absolutely no room to improve anything else from that point forward, which is simply not the case with most pro pitchers. So much of the decline in velocity is actually not due to aging per se. There are certain adaptations that do occur with aging gradually and over time, but it's actually due to the accumulation of injuries. So whether somebody's 24, 25 years old and they start having this accumulation of injuries, each injury basically sucks some adaptability from your body, and it creates a domino effect where that previous injury now increases the risk of another injury, another injury, another injury. So if you're able to stay relatively injury-free, it actually reduces the risk of that next injury happening. If you start to accumulate injuries, it increases the risk of another injury happening. And so he's been able to so far stay out of that death spiral where the injuries begin to pile up. So here are three main ways to continue to increase velocity as you age. And the first one would be just increased effort. I don't think this applies to Aroldis Chapman in his case because he was still throwing max effort earlier in his career. Some good examples of this would be Justin Verlander, Charlie Morton, guys that seem to be defying aging, but it's really a matter of they used to cruise and now they're pitching at more of a higher percentage of their 100%. The second would be increasing or improving mechanical efficiency. And a lot of people take for granted how big of a role this can play. And so it can be as simple as 1 or 2 slight tweaks can lead to 1, 2, 3 miles an hour on average fastball velocity. It can be significantly more than that depending on how egregious the mechanical flaw is. But with Chapman, again, he was a little bit off with some of his timing. He hooked up with Hector Berrios in the offseason leading into 2023. Essentially, they just worked on staying in his back leg a little bit longer. He had a slower tempo last year as he was kind of getting comfortable with that. You can really see he was exaggerating that feeling of finding his load. This year, he's a little bit more comfortable, it looks like. And this year, the tempo has sped up a little bit closer to what he was earlier in his career. And then the third way would be improving strength or power output later into your career. So you might not realize it, but a lot of players have not fully maxed out their entire body in their 20s. They haven't fully dialed in every single routine they have. They're not as strong as they could possibly ever be at 22 years old. Now in Chapman's case, because he was able to get so much stronger over the years, what I believe is that he's actually went a little bit further towards the force end of the continuum. And so you'll have very reactive, springy, elastic type movers where the way he was producing his velocity earlier in his career, he didn't have much muscle mass. He wasn't as strong. So he was relying much more on the rubber bands in his body, the fascia, the tendons to produce that velocity. As he's gotten stronger, he's supplying more of that velocity from the actual force side of the equation, from the muscle mass, from the raw strength. And so you can see that in the quality of his movement. He was a lot springier in terms of how he moved earlier in his career. And it's a little bit more like kind of brute force in terms of how he moves now. It's still great, but he's shifted a little bit more towards the force end of that continuum in terms of how he produces that velocity. We see this all the time in our facility. Pro pitchers come to us after an injury, after some sort of setback. Everything that we're doing is trying to figure out how can we take a 27-year-old pro pitcher, an indie ball guy, how can we get them back? So one example would be Brock Stewart, right? He came to us in 2020. He was an indie ball. He was on the back half of his career, and through getting him healthy, through increasing mechanical efficiency, and through improving overall strength and power output, he's been able to get into the upper 90s, touching 100 miles an hour over the last couple of years as a 31, 32-year-old. So to summarize how Chapman's velocity has been able to stay relatively constant, essentially he's put on 50 pounds, he's gotten significantly stronger, and he's buffered a lot of that expected decline in that elasticity and that reactivity and that power output by continuing to get stronger over time. And so that's essentially buffered or canceled out a lot of that age-related decline that you might expect. But he's been able to largely buffer that by continuing to get so much stronger later on in his career, which is just highly unusual. Now, if we extrapolate this back and we say, what would it look like if Aroldis Chapman could have been this strong at 22, 23 years old? I think there's a very strong argument to make that he could have been throwing 105, 106, possibly even touching 107 miles an hour at that age if he had been 225, 230, as strong as he is now, while still being as elastic, as fast twitch as he was as a 22, 23-year-old. So Chapman's been historically super durable, but how much longer could he theoretically sustain this type of output? Does he have 3 more years in, 5 more years, 10 more years? So we had our data team actually run some of the numbers for historically hard-throwing pitchers in the pitch tracking area who have pitched at least 2 seasons past the age of 35, had a general idea of what are the typical velocity declines for average fastball velocity. And so we extrapolate this and we look, there's about a 2-mile-an-hour loss in average fastball velocity from age 35 to about age 40. So over those 5 years, we can expect Aroldis Chapman to lose on average about 2 miles an hour. This means that if he's averaging just under 99 miles an hour, touching 105, and again, touching 101 whenever he wants in an 0-2, 1-2 count, that he could still potentially be averaging just under 97, touching 99, 100 whenever he wants, and touching 103 miles an hour on his best bullet at 41 years old. Again, there are so many factors that it's really hard to make that conclusive statement, because if he gets injured, all bets are off. If there's a major injury that leads to another injury that robs him of that adaptability, that robs him of his ability to get into certain positions in his mechanics, then all bets are off. This is almost certainly still good enough to be a big league closer, or at least a productive big league reliever, especially if he can find a way to be more productive from a pitchability standpoint. If he can get that walk rate down from 1st percentile and maybe get up to 20th percentile, right, he can certainly continue pitching for at least another 5 years. Now, what if we extrapolate that out even further and we say, what if he's continuing at that same rate of decline for the following 5 years? What does that look like at 46 years old, 47 years old? Now, that would still put him somewhere in the 95 to 97 range, touching 101 miles an hour at 46 years old. Now, I don't know if that's going to be competitive enough if he isn't able to command the baseball, add another pitch, or just revamp his overall effectiveness as a pitcher, because he's able to just overpower people still. So we will have to improve his pitchability if he's going to still be pitching in his mid-40s. So some key takeaways and how can we apply this to our own careers. So the first is that, again, Chapman is an anomaly. Be careful imitating everything that he's doing, because he does represent such an extreme case. And so we got to be careful extrapolating outliers and into our own routines and what we're doing, because they're just so much different from us. But the first thing is that total body strength is injury protected. protective, especially when we look at the UCL strength of the flexor pronator muscles. So we've done videos on arm care. We'll go ahead and link some of those down below so you can make sure that you're strengthening each of those individual flexor pronator muscles to the extent that you possibly can. The second thing is to try to improve, or at the very least maintain, mechanical efficiency as you age. This won't be as relevant for high school, college players watching this video. This is more relevant for guys that are currently playing professionally, that are in their late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s. So it's not necessarily going to be an issue, but this is always something to keep in mind. You can continually improve the efficiency through which you transfer energy from the ground, from the back leg, from the back foot, up through the body, through the arm. That's not only potentially injury protective, but also going to be performance enhancing as well. And then the next thing is to just manage workloads. Don't regularly throw through fatigue if you don't have to. That's a huge risk factor when it comes to injury. You might not be able to do quite as conservative of a throwing program in the off season as Aroldis Chapman. You're probably going to have to put your foot on the gas a little bit more than he is, because you probably don't know you're going to be able to roll into spring training and throw 100 miles an hour whenever you want. So you're likely going to have to be a little more aggressive than he is, but we can still mitigate some of the unnecessary injury risk by not having completely outlandish workloads. On the lifting side, you're likely going to have to tap into more speed and power type training as opposed to just purely focusing on strength and hypertrophy type training like Aroldis Chapman. But again, certain phases of strength and hypertrophy throughout the year can potentially be injury protective as well, and part of a well-rounded plan for your training program. And then next, what most pitchers do, as they do inevitably have some sort of decline over the course of their career, is to continually work on improving their pitchability and improving their secondary stuff. Think of Zach Greinke as a great example. You can continue to combat that decrease in performance by improving pitchability, improving the other side of the equation as well. Chapman has again made continual efforts to add secondary pitches to improve his command, but at this point in time, he's still able to get by just being an absolutely overpowering pitcher without having to focus as much on his command. Chapman is incredible to watch, and with any luck, we'll get to continue watching him dominate hitters for at least the next 5 years. Guys, thanks so much for making it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this content, go ahead and give us a thumbs up, and if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and do that right now. Finally, we read every single comment down below, so if you have suggestions on this video or for a future video, how we could make this better, we're gonna read that, we'll respond to you, and we'll definitely take that into consideration in terms of planning out future videos for this channel. Again, appreciate you guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video.